This is a Pallet Chief 2 model 4848 with a standard stacker. And I'm going to go through a demonstration of initial setup. Once you have your machine in place, and I'm going to start out with pointing out the air supply and the electrical connections. Here we have the location for the 3/4 inch air hose to be connected to the nipple. And this is the air shutoff for that. This exhausts all the air on the machine. You can turn it on to bring air into the machine. And that is the exhaust that exhausts all the air off of the nailer and the stacker. Everything has no air on it when you do that. Then we have the 120 volt electrical connection here, as long as you've got that connected. And then, of course, this is the air supply that goes to the stacker. And it goes here, and there's a regulator that regulates the air going into the stacker. And you want that basically at 120 pounds. This regulator here is the regulator that controls the air going to the nail guns and the other parts of the machine. This is the only regulator that controls the amount of pressure going to the nail guns. And you want this on 110 pounds. So in order to get started, you turn the air supply on, and we have electrical power. This regulator is used to control the amount of air that goes to the bottom board spacers, and you want that on about 40 pounds, just enough to raise and lower the board spacers. While we're talking about regulators, we have a regulator on the gantry. This regulator controls the amount of air pressure that goes to the triggers of the nail guns. The triggers of the nail guns, they don't need to have the full air pressure that the air supply going to the nail guns has. That needs to be 110 pounds. The amount of pressure going to the trigger needs to be somewhat less than that, around 90 pounds preferably. So I'm going to turn this down just a little bit to right there at 90 pounds. Okay. So the next thing you do in order to get ready to set the machine up on a particular pallet, first we start at the jig, and we're going to need to adjust the jig. Okay, now in order to adjust the width of the pallet, we're going to be setting this machine up on a 48 by 40 pallet. And so what I'm going to do to start with is get a 40-inch deck board, and I'm going to lay it in the jig because that's where we want to adjust the jig to. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the flanges on the outside, and you only need to tighten these bolts snug. You don't need to over tighten them because it will cause them to strip out. This is how you tell if you've got it loose enough for the jig to move. If those bolts are loose to where you can move them with your finger, then they're loose. Then you come here and you loosen this one to be able to adjust the jig. And then we go to the other side. Now that we have that loose, we are ready to adjust the flanges for the width of the pallet. And you do this with the quick adjust handle, and you turn this crank, you turn it counterclockwise to bring it in. Oh yeah. And we turn the hand crank until we get the jig set at about 40 inches. And you want to adjust that to where it has a little bit of slack so that you don't have it too tight for the pallet. So that is about right. Now, one thing important to remember is on this machine we have a graduated marker here. It's a ruler basically, And this ruler starts out at 0 in the center. That's 0 inches, and that's where you always want your center stringer to be, in the middle. If you're building a 4-stringer pallet, of course you set them however far apart you need for this to have the 2 middle stringers. But for a 3-runner pallet, you set it up where it's dead center on 0, and you measure and do the same thing on the far end, have it set on 0, and then you adjust the flanges to make it 40 inches wide. So we've already adjusted for the width. Now we're going to put a stringer in there. And the way you adjust for the stringer for the thickness of the stringer, there's a bolt on the bottom of the flange here that you have to get to from underneath. And you put the ratchet on there and you loosen that. You loosen that bolt. And when you've got that loose enough, then you can move this up top, up here. Now let's come up top. So, and once you get that set in place for the right thickness of the stringer, then you go back down and you tighten up the bolt. So that's how you adjust for the thickness of the stringer. So we'll put the other 2 runners in. Some people call these stringers, some people call these runners. And I'll use different names for them sometime myself. So now we have the runners in place. Now I'm going to put the bottom boards on. But first, in order to do that, I have to lift up the bottom board spacer. So we've got the right placement for the bottom boards. So I hear an air leak on the nail gun. This is a great example. I'm going to show you how to fix that. Evidently this air pressure is too low. So I turned it up a little bit, just enough to make the air pressure even out, so the triggers are not leaking air now. So, in order to adjust where you want your boards to be, you use an Allen wrench and you set them where you want them, and they slide back and forth. And when you get them where you want them, you just lock it in place. And by the way, we have spare extra board spacer bars that you can get, bottom board spacer bars and top board spacer bars that you can get, so you can have them set up for an additional pallet. So once you get these boards set where you want them, of course you want the first board to be flush with the end of your stringer. And we have these already preset. And then we have these boards already set in place also. Now, and you also have extra board spacers. So what you can do with those is just put them anywhere you want to on the bar to keep them out of the way. But they're fine, they're not in the way right there. In order to adjust the nail guns, first you loosen the board positioner brackets to get them out of the way. And then you tighten those back up. And all these bolts on this machine, you only need to snug them. You don't need to over tighten them because that's unnecessary. Now I've got this gun bracket that's too far to the outside, so I need to move it to the inside. So what I do is I get it loose, and then I simply bump it over till it lines up, and I just eyeball it, and I push the gantry down to see if it's lined up with the runner. That looks like it's lined up. So now that I've got it lined up, I tighten it back up. So this gun is lined up. So that gun is set. Now, since I've moved this gun more toward the middle, I also need to adjust the coil of nails behind it, the spindles. So, ideally what you want here, you want this spindle to be leaning forward ever so slightly so that the angle of the nails is lined up with the angle of the nails when the guns are in the down position. And also you want the coil of nails to be lined up left to right so that when the coil is about half empty, that it will line up perfectly going down through the nail guide. So in order to adjust this, I loosen these bolts on the back side. And I'm careful to keep the angle of the spindle the same. And then I slide it. Then I slide it over so that when it's about half empty here, it'll be lined up with that nail guide. And then I tighten these back down just good and snug. So that one is ready to go. Now we will go over here to the other side and adjust this nail gun. Obviously you can see this nail gun, as long as you continue to build a 3-stringer pallet, this nail gun should not have to be moved because it's always going to stay in the center. First I move this board positioner. And it's not critical that these board positioners be moved exact. You just want them to be balanced so that they will pull both sides of the board evenly as you pull the gantry forward. Now I'm loosening the bolts that hold the gun bracket in place, and now I'm going to slide it over. And I'm going to pull the handle down to see if it lines up. That looks good. So I tighten it back up. Once again, you notice I'm holding the wrench short here. I don't want to pull on this part of the handle because you tighten it too much holding it out here. So I just hold the ratchet short so I don't over tighten the bolts. Now we have those guns in place. In order to set the firing pattern for the nail guns, we're going to use the firing bar over here. Now let me explain the firing bar real quick. This firing bar is very simple. First of all, it uses these firing pins to tell the guns where to fire. The ones on the top side correspond to this top sensor, which is a magnetic proximity switch. The ones on the bottom side correspond with the bottom sensor, which is for the bottom boards. And so everywhere that one of these passes for the top cycle, it will fire nails. Now, once you get the first, in order to set the first nail, what you do is you pull this gantry up to where the guns will be. So when you get to the first position where the first nail is going to be, you can line up this part of the nail gun to where you want the first nail to be right there, and then you take your first firing pin and you put it here. So it's lined up. This is for the bottom boards. Bottom boards line up the same way. You take and tighten the first one right under where the proximity sensor is, and once you get that one tight, the good trick about this is once you get the first nail, then you take the firing bar off and you take it and flip it right over, because that's where the bottom board firing pins are. And you line up the first pin with where the nail is, then you light up the second pin to where a nail would be on the board, and then you do the same thing with the second board and the third board and the fourth board. That's the quickest way to do this and get it done. All you do is use the sensor on the first one to line it up, and then you can simply lay the firing bar up here with your boards in place and line the rest of the firing pins up like that. So now we've got that done. I'm going to take that and put it back where it was. This is spring loaded. It just pops in position and stays just like that, and it don't move. Perfect. That looks good. And I'm going to pull it forward one time as a practice without holding the trigger. You notice, as I pull this forward, the first thing I do is I pull it down so that the guns are resting there. But you also notice that when it gets to the board, that the board positioners, which are here, they pull the board firmly up against the board spacers before the guns fire. And that looks good. Now let me make sure we've got power and air. Make sure my nail guns are on. And by the way, this is individual shut-off and exhaust for each nail gun. If you're going to work on the nail gun, always turn the air off. Always. Never change the nails or anything else with this air on. If you're going to change the nails, turn the air on. And then when you're ready, you can turn the air back on. So now, in order to make sure we have all the power on, we turn this switch, which is the gun switch. The guns will not fire unless this is on. You turn that to on position. This is for the stacker. And the stacker switch that's to turn it on so that it'll stack pallets when the pallets go in. So now we're ready to try it and see how it does. See if it'll fire. You notice this board was out of place, and the board positioner pulled it right into place before the guns fired. So now we have that done. So the first thing I do, I go down with that handle, which brings the bottom board spacers down. And let me show you this also. When you go down with that handle, the bottom board spacers go down, but there's a switch right here that when you go up and down with that valve to lower the bottom board spacers, it triggers that switch. And what that does is that changes the nail pattern from the bottom cycle to the top cycle on the proximity sensors. Now, before I flip the pallet, there's something I forgot to do, and that is I forgot to tighten up the bolts where I adjusted the flanges. These bolts are here. They're not tight, so I need to tighten these up. And these bolts, if you can see right here, there's a little clip down here that holds up on this piece of angle that holds this flange in place. So that's how that works. And when you tighten these up, you don't want to get them too tight, just good and snug. So now that we have that done, we're ready to flip the pallet. You can flip it whichever way works best for you. I like to flip it like this. But in order to put the top boards on, I have to adjust the board spacer bars. We already have the board spacers in the right location, and you know how to adjust those from adjusting the bottom board spacers. And what you want to do is adjust this bar, so this bar will be high enough so that these board spacers are laying flat down on top of the runner. And the way you do that is by loosening the hinge post on this board spacer bar, and you raise it up. And now, as you can see here, this board spacer is flat against the runner here. So now I've got that in place on this end, so I tighten it up. And once again, you don't want to over tighten. And I go to the other end, and this one is adjusted properly. So I tighten the bolt on it. And now we have this board spacer bar is perfect with the board spacers laying down on top of the runner. I come to the other side and I repeat the same process. So now we have the board spacer bars in place, and then we lay our boards on top. In this case, once again, we're using 4 boards for the top. And now, we do this, we repeat the same process for the top board firing pattern as we did for the bottom. And this time, we bring the gantry up to the first firing pin. Well, actually to where the nails start, and the nails will begin there. So you line the sensor up and you tighten the first sensor. Then you pull the gantry back out of the way, and then you lay the firing bar up here and you line up the first firing pin to where the first nail belongs. And then you bring the next firing pin here, and then these two firing pins for this board, and so forth and so on. And you get that done, you put the firing bar back in place. By the way, you can order extra firing bars so that you can have multiple pallets set up already and go from one pallet to another in a changeover that's very fast. So we have the firing pattern in place. We've got the top boards in place. Now, one thing we want to do also is we want to make sure that you check the level of the gantry and make sure that the guns are just floating a little bit above the pallet once you have the boards on top of the pallet. You adjust that by using a ratchet with a 7/8 socket, and you put it on this bolt that turns this Acme rod that moves this spring back and forth to tighten or loosen the tension. So if you want to raise the gantry up a little bit, you tighten it like that. If you want to lower the gantry a little bit, you loosen it like that. So that's how you adjust the level of the guns. Now that I have that in place, I'm ready to nail the top boards. I have my gun switch on, everything is on. Put my top board holders in place so that to keep the boards from bouncing over the top of the board spacers. I hold the trigger, and by the way, you must hold this trigger on the gantry for the guns to fire. If you're not holding that trigger, the guns won't fire. Obviously, when you get to the front, you release the trigger so that the guns don't fire on the way back. And here we go. So, the pallet is complete. Now, the next thing I do when I have the pallet complete and ready to stack, now I go and adjust the stacker. And in order to do that, I bring one of the boards that's going to be identical to the first board on the bottom of the pallet. But the first thing I do to mess with the stacker and adjust it, I turn off the air supply. Okay, we're building a 48 by 40 pallet. We have a 40-inch board here. So I take that 40-inch board and I lay it in here like this. And I adjust the width of the stacker by turning the hand crank. As a rule of thumb, you want to leave about a 1/2 inch of space between the board and the flange when you adjust it that tight. So we basically have the width set. It's that simple. Now, what we want to do is we want to talk about the board catchers. What these do, the pallet catchers. When the pallet comes in, the pallet rolls over the top of these and it goes over behind these and it catches them and keeps the pallet from bouncing up into the stacker. So ideally what you want to do is bring this board in here and put it in here and have these to where they're about a 1/2 inch from this board. This is adjusted a little bit too wide, but for this demonstration we'll use that spacing. It'll be okay. And the same thing over here. You want about a 1/4 inch to maybe a 1/2 inch of space between the board and these. And the way you adjust these is from bolts that are on the bottom side, and you loosen those bolts, and this pallet catcher will slide down this roller to where it goes right up against the board like that. Now, I got to go turn the air on so it will stack. What I like to do once I'm through with the pallet, I like to pick up on the front edge of it and shut it. Now, in order to get these in the right position, you loosen these bolts on here and you put them where it'll hold the pallet up and keep the pallet stacked straight. And you want to put these like this one is at this end, this one's in the middle, that one's on that end. And when you adjust these, you want to leave some space between this ring and this board position. I mean this flipper, pallet flipper, because you don't want it tight up against there or this won't move. You also want to angle these bolts to where they're at an angle slightly out to the outside, so that every time that the pallet goes up, it won't stretch the spring. It'll only push it that far. You don't want these straight up or over against this side. You want these to be leaning toward the outside ever so slightly. So there you go.